Good afternoon. Welcome to the Korea Society and welcome to Studio Korea. We're delighted to have such an overwhelming response here in our studio audience today. I'd like to take a few minutes and just welcome you all to our spring policy season and to let you know that we actually have a very active summer policy calendar that will be out very shortly. Also, by way of your entree today, you may have noticed that we have a small artistic representation here on the North Korean human rights issue that was put together for Asia Week, which is just concluding. And we wanted to point out that we have not only the vessel exhibited in the case out front, the Shilla vessel, a representative of the ancient Korean and the individual. We also had a tie-in with Nobel winner Elie Wiesel, his book Night, and its connection to Blaine Hardin's Escape from Camp 14. Those of you who were here for that book release might recall that he mentioned that he was hoping that book would in some way be very much like Elie Wiesel's classic Night and influence a whole generation of young thinkers on issues of human rights, atrocities, and the quest for liberation and for accountability. And the last component of it, which is all very important, from our artist in residence, Jahi Yu, who is here in the room. Jahi has done a representation, thank you, a wonderful etching that captures an image of that suffering, and we do appreciate her artistic talent. She will be around at the conclusion for those of you who are interested in her artistic endeavor and body of work. We're appreciative for that. Today we would like to welcome our very special guest, whom you're here for, Frank Jannuzi. Frank is one of the analysts par excellence in the United States and worldwide on Asian affairs and U.S. perspective. And to our great pleasure, he is also an expert on human rights issues in his capacity currently as the Deputy Executive Director for Amnesty International. And thank you to those of you here in the audience from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Frank has had an important leadership role with Amnesty International. You may know that in the years prior, Frank served as a senior advisor and the director of policy for Asia with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and worked very closely at that time with then Senator Biden and Senator Kerry. Where are those guys now? But anyway, they
terrible career moves they made.
Wonderful moves and wonderful public service, and Frank served an instrumental role with both of those talented individuals, and so we're grateful to have him here today. I'm also proud to announce that Frank is the president-designate for the Mansfield Foundation, which honors the legacy of Mike and Maureen Mansfield and does tremendous work on understanding between Asia and the United States. And so congratulations on that new appointment. Frank takes up those responsibilities on April 28th. Please help me in welcoming Frank Jannuzi.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Frank. Frank, I wanted to turn really to the issue at hand first off, which is this incredibly important report, 400 pages that have come out about 10 days ago that document these atrocities, the result of a year-long United Nations inquiry called into play by the United Nations High Commissioner Navi Pillai and 3 very skilled jurists who led the effort to try to do as much documentation, fact-finding, and interviewing. If you could tell us what you make of the report findings and what you think about the state at the moment of North Korea's culpability and the atrocities at hand.
Thanks, Stephen. And it's my great pleasure to be here at the Korea Society, and I'm long been an admirer of the work that the Korea Society does in bridging the Pacific between the United States and the Korean Peninsula. And really, the attention that the Korea Society has paid to the situation in Korea, North and South, is something that we now hope that this report will much broaden in the international community. Because for those of us who have been studying the situation in North Korea for a long time, I can't say that there was much in the report that really came as a great surprise. But what is stunning is to see it all compiled in one place. The eyewitness testimony, the satellite imagery commissioned by Amnesty USA and other groups, the reports of those who have worked inside the country and witnessed firsthand some of the suffering related to food insecurity. To see 400 pages of personal narrative, of satellite images of prison labor camps the size of the District of Columbia, housing more than 100,000 prisoners, political prisoners, To see the compilation of this in one place is, as Navi Pillay has said, an urgent call to action. There can no longer be any excuse for anyone who was either claiming to be unaware or who had never seen this documented evidence of systematic human rights abuses presented before the world community. There's no excuse for inaction. But the problem, of course, is, well, what does that action look like? And I hope that that's something that we'll talk about today, because it's not obvious what the international community can or should do in response to such shocking testimony. But before we get there, I mean, I think it is incumbent on us to be clear about what we're looking at. This is a state where the most basic human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, freedom of mobility and movement, are denied, and where generations of families can be imprisoned without trial or due process in a labor camp which is equivalent to a death sentence. Children, parents, grandparents, 3 generations sent together for the crimes of one, a form of collective punishment in these Kwanliso labor camps. And in these camps, unspeakable brutality, rape, public execution, starvation, no health, brutal work conditions on an inadequate diet, no heat, obviously no air conditioning. People worked to death. And the conditions of these camps have been well documented now. It's not something that the North Korean government can plausibly deny. We don't know everything. It's hard to see in a satellite image what's happening on the ground, and yet it's remarkable how much you can tell. Skilled photo interpreters with whom we have worked from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science can look at the piles of coal and see how many hours of labor it took to dig that coal out of the mountain. And you can look at the facilities and the capacity of how many prisoners are in those camps. So you can tell a lot, but you can't tell everything. And it would have been wonderful had the North Korean government agreed to cooperate with the Commission, to allow the commissioners to see for themselves the conditions on the ground. I know as an Amnesty employee that we don't always get it right. There's almost always a nuance to the issue or a facet of the issue that we may not fully understand until we can see it with our own eyes. I recently led a delegation back to Vietnam. It was the first time that Amnesty had been to Vietnam in 25 years. And the Vietnamese said, well, sometimes you make mistakes. I said, well, I'm sure we make mistakes. Why don't you let us into the country and see for ourselves, and we'll do better. But of course, North Korea did not allow that access. And so to the extent that the full story hasn't yet been told, they have no one but themselves to blame.
Yeah. And one can only surmise from this testimonial, and I'd like you to say a few words about that human testimony, because it's been striking. I think many of my South Korean colleagues who heard the Seoul testimonials were quite shocked. Certainly what we read in the report is shocking. And when you combine what you've talked about in terms of looking at things like photographs, imagery, we've had a session here on mapping through Google Earth. Mm-hmm. One can only hear echoes of the killing fields, or Srebrenica times many. And how, Frank, in 2014, can we have this large-scale types of abuses? What do you make of that? What do you make of the testimonials?
Well, I think they're very compelling, and I think they're accurate. And I think that those who deny them as fabrications are living in denial about the truth of North Korea. Having said that, it's completely plausible to me that most North Koreans themselves have little real concept of what's happening inside their own country to those who are most abused. There is no mobility. There are no cell phones outside of Pyongyang, and the cell phones that they have really only work, to connect the 2 million elite who have them with each other. Mm-hmm. The ability to get accurate information into the North Korean people is quite limited. North Korea is not a hermetically sealed kingdom, as it's been described by some people. There are thousands of visitors, mostly from China. There are Westerners who visit and come in and out. There are even Western NGO groups on the ground inside North Korea doing important humanitarian work on a small scale. But none of this translates into broad access by the North Korean people to information about the kind of testimony that we can read in the UN report. And I think if the North Korean people, in fact, become more aware of their own country's circumstances as it relates to the rest of the world, that may be the key to beginning to build a coalition for change. It doesn't have to be a color revolution or overthrow even necessarily of the Kim family, but change will come to North Korea, I believe, principally when the North Korean people themselves demand it, including the elites. And there's some precedents for this. I mean, if you look at a country like Burma, in my view, it wasn't until the sons and daughters of the generals said, "Papa, why do I have to go to Singapore to ride on an escalator? Why is there nothing to buy in my country? Why is our country falling so far behind its neighbors?" That the change was possible there.
Do you have a sense from looking through your work with Amnesty or looking at this report about perhaps the exchange of information within North Korean society? Are there whispers of the camps? I'm thinking about the Nazi-era experience, which this has been likened to by the report's commission.
There are, and it's growing because of the numbers of defectors and people who are fleeing the country is also growing. It may not seem like a big number, but I think there's more than 50,000 now, or about 50,000 North Koreans who have left North Korea since the end of the Korean War. But most of them have left in the last 10 years. The overwhelming majority of them have left in recent times. There was a spike during the famine when people fled into China to get food. Many of them are still in China. There's a diaspora, cross-border population. But knowledge is spreading. It's spreading through technologies like thumb drives, because there's greater access to computers inside North Korea now. And if you have a thumb drive with downloaded with South Korean soap operas or Amnesty International human rights reports, those now can be viewed by more and more North Koreans. And it's also changing because of the permeability of the country in terms of business people coming and going. And as Barbara Demick wrote so movingly in her book, Nothing to Envy, when one of the people she describes, North Koreans, gets across the border finally and sees a bowl of rice and meat outside of a Chinese household, and the stunning realization that she has that this is for the dog, but it's more food and better food than she has seen in North Korea in her life. The visits to China and then the return to North Korea is also making undeniable to the North Korean people just how far behind they are.
Interesting. When Shin Dong-hyuk, the subject of the book Escape from Camp 14, was here at the Korea Society on that book's release, and he later was the first person to testify in Seoul as part of the commission's investigation. He emphasized that it was that quest for meat alone, which was his motivator. He stated he had no grand illusions about freedom or what that would promise, but it was just the quest for meat that he had heard when he was being tortured and imprisoned underground with another prisoner who told him about meat that could be found outside. Fascinating. You've mentioned the Chinese businessmen and we've alluded to the fact that there is a need for international action. It sort of brings the question of China into play. The concern now is, now that we have this report out, we've had a call for international action, but a concern that China would veto any recommendation to the International Criminal Court, which is what the Commission would like to see happen. How do you see China's role and China's potential blocking, keeping in mind that Park Geun-hye just this week met with Xi Jinping and emphasized that from a South Korean perspective that would not be appropriate?
Yes, so the Chinese role here is so fascinating, Stephen, because on the one hand, they are without question the country that has the greatest opportunity to influence North Korea's behavior. On the other hand, I think that their influence is often overstated. I was in Beijing just before the second nuclear test, meeting with Chinese officials on behalf of Senator Kerry. And they assured me, oh, don't worry, Frank, we've told the North Koreans no more nuclear tests, and they're going to listen to Big Brother. Well, it was a couple days later that they lit off the second nuke.
Mm.
I think China cannot dictate anything to North Korea. So what will China do in the face of this overwhelming evidence that their ally, ostensible ally, and the country that they're supporting economically is systematically brutalizing its own people? We know that China won't support sanctions in response to this, and we know pretty well that they will block attempts by the UN Security Council to refer this matter to the International Criminal Court. But are there other mechanisms that they might support, other forms of engagement, or even forms of accountability that they might be willing to support? I think they need to be explored. The Chinese are going to counsel the international community that the appropriate response is to engage North Korea. And on this, I would agree with them. But it has to be a principled, hard-headed, focused engagement. Engagement is not giving away goodies to North Korea. It's finding ways to address the immediate humanitarian needs of the North Korean people, to open the country further to international news, information, analysis of their situation, so that the North Korean people themselves might someday be empowered as change agents. And it's also engaging in a way that deters the North Korean government from continuing some of the worst human rights abuses. Shining a spotlight on injustice is what Amnesty International sort of does best. But naming and shaming is not enough, right? You have to find channels of engagement. And I would hope that Park Geun-hye's idea of the Seoul process, or the trust politique, her government also has discussed something called the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, which would be sort of a track two, people-to-people engagement with the North on issues like public health. I would hope that these initiatives could be pursued, because I think they could have immediate benefit for the welfare of the North Korean people. Probably not for the 120,000 in the gulags, although even there, the possibility of a Red Cross visit, the possibility of some sort of international scrutiny of the health conditions in these labor camps, to me is something that could be explored in the context of this overall engagement initiative. But right now we don't see appetite for it.
Sure. To get to the root of the Chinese argument, I mean, basically they're saying we can't accept the report because investigators weren't allowed into North Korea. But the reason the reason investigators were not in North Korea is they were not
It's
allowed
a
into North Korea.
classic Chinese catch-22. They will deny the existence of human rights abuses in Tibet. If someone asserts that they're going on, they'll say, well, no, you don't know the true story because you've never been there. We'd like to go there. I'm sorry, you're not allowed. The Chinese here should not be playing defense for North Korea. They should be joining with an international consensus that North Korea needs to change its conduct. One of the things the Chinese could do, completely within their own borders and completely consistent with their principled position that they don't want to interfere in the internal affairs of other states, would be to simply honor their UNHCR obligations to treat every North Korean who is inside that country as a refugee, as someone fleeing oppression, and allow them safe passage out of the country, end the refoulement of hundreds and sometimes thousands of North Koreans back to North Korea, where they face execution, brutality, and imprisonment. That's not Chinese interference in North Korea's internal affairs. That's China living up to its international obligations as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So maybe this would be the narrow end of the wedge for where to begin with the Chinese in terms of their response to the Commission of Inquiry, because this Commission of Inquiry report should leave no doubt in the minds of the Chinese that those who have fled North Korea have a legitimate fear of persecution.
Let's get to the issue that you started to speak to about Park Geun-hye and the trust politique policy. This week we had some important meetings at The Hague. One was between President Park and President Xi. Another, which has received a lot of attention, was among President Obama, President Park Geun-hye, and Prime Minister Abe. how do you see the calculus in terms of the strategic relations and the pressures and concerns about issues like unification, or for some of those other entities, a shared interest in North Korea provocations, certainly nuclear development, what we've seen in terms of missiles, and the balance with human rights?
Well, Stephen, I'm glad that Abe and Park Geun-hye and Obama met. It's an important first step to sort of break the ice and improve coordination among these three important allies on the situation in North Korea. I don't think they managed to resolve anything. I think that, in fact, a lot of the history questions that bedevil the relationships are not resolvable in the near term or even in the midterm. It's going to take generational change, and these are differences and tensions that have to be managed. And they must be managed because coordinated action with respect to North Korea is essential. And the North Koreans have a long track record of playing one off against the other. And we've seen hints of this in recent weeks. The North Koreans allowed the grandparents of Megumi Yokota to meet, the parents of Megumi Yokota, who was kidnapped as a little girl from Japan, lived in North Korea, married, gave birth to a daughter, and the daughter, the grandchild of Megumi Yokota's parents, was allowed to meet her grandparents for the first time in Mongolia recently. Well, this is a step forward on a basic human rights issue. And similarly, President Park Geun-hye has been working assiduously to try to restore the family reunification visits between North and South. And again, a very important basic human rights issue, the ability to see and speak to your family. And the North does this in a calculated way, often. Whenever they fear that maybe new sanctions might be coming or new pressures might be coming, then they try to, peel away the consensus. So these three nations have to work together, U.S., Japan, South Korea, and they need to come up with an approach to the North that they all can agree on. And to do that, I think they need to stop putting the emphasis on plutonium and start putting the emphasis on people. By putting people before plutonium, we actually have the opportunity to shape the negotiating environment within which the nuclear talks might eventually resume. It's not as if there's been such great progress on the nuclear side, that we feel that, we should be pursuing that full speed. So why not shift the focus? Why not look at the people of North Korea, their circumstances, collectively by the international community, and see whether that doesn't unlock the box where some of the nuclear solutions might be found.
Frank, before we turn to our audience, who are largely gathered for that very reason of sympathies and concerns about the people of North Korea, let me ask you a final question, which is how you might look at this in anticipating, say, 20 years out, and you look back at this page of history and North Korean human rights abuses, a very difficult period here, the persistence, the last of the Leninists, the persistence of the Cold War through this. What do you think in terms of the demands for accountability, how that figures into the unification process, and where you as an American observer would like to hopefully see that at some point?
So, I'm really going to be torn to answer your question, because I have my Amnesty hat, and then I have 25 years of government experience where I was taught to be pragmatic. And wearing my Amnesty hat, I look at the issue of transitional justice and accountability as an imperative for North Korea. At some point in time, those responsible for these horrific crimes against humanity should be held accountable. And as an Amnesty member and believer, I can be very patient about that. Rios Montt, some bad criminals around the world, occasionally it comes back to haunt them. It may take 30 years for justice to be done for the Khmer Rouge leaders in Cambodia, but eventually, where there's a record, there can be accountability. But as a pragmatist today, I would say the emphasis cannot be on justice just quite yet, because there's no practical opportunity for there to be justice tomorrow or next year. And so we need to focus on what we will tell our children, what I will tell my daughter. Daddy, what did you do when you learned about this condition inside North Korea? What did you do immediately to try to begin to redress it? Because even one day of inaction, in my mind, is a day too many. And if there was nothing to be done, I would say, well, Zoe, we threw up our hands in defeat and we sat around and we had a policy of strategic patience, and we just thought we'll just wait them out. Eventually maybe they'll come tumbling down under their own weight. But I don't believe that policy is working, if it is even to be called a policy. And I think there are things that can be done. You could start with putting China a little bit under the gun on refoulement, but then you could begin with a lesson that Jimmy Carter taught me. Just before Jimmy Carter went to Pyongyang in 1994, and this may seem counterintuitive, but I hope you might agree with me. He was briefed by the State Department on the situation in North Korea, and at the end of a day-long briefing, he and Rosalind Carter turned to me and other briefers, and he said, "Now, none of you have told me what I need to know." And we all just kind of looked down at our feet, and we felt ashamed. He says, "I need to know, what does Kim Il-sung want?" And again, we all looked at our feet because none of us had a clue. And he says, "I'll tell you what Kim Il-sung wants. He wants my respect, and I'm going to give it to him." Well, this is one of those awkward moments in history where we have this report which calls into question whether anyone in the leadership of North Korea should be given any respect of any kind. But if the world community is passionate about addressing the circumstances that the report documents, we're going to have to. We're going to have to. In order to gain access, in order to begin to affect change. And that brings us back to Senator Mansfield, who taught my old boss, Senator Biden, and taught me, never impugn another man's motives. We have to suspend disbelief. We have to say to ourselves, surely if Kim Jong-un really knew what was going on in those gulags, he would want to put a stop to it and end the suffering, wouldn't he? And we have to engage with that spirit in order to try to affect change. So maybe a little bit provocative comment to make, but I don't think that we get anywhere only by naming and shaming. We must know the truth, but then we have to fashion practical, pragmatic responses that might actually improve the situation for the North Korean people. And that should be the benchmark that we use, not whether we are so pure as to not, soil our hands by shaking hands with people who are, in all likelihood, responsible for serious crimes.
Frank, is there a message that goes with President Obama's April visit to Northeast Asia that figures with this?
I would hope it's the message that the United States rebalance, pivot, whatever you call it, means that we're going to invest some diplomatic energy in the situation on the Korean Peninsula, commensurate to the human suffering that is going on there and has been documented by the Commission of Inquiry. It's not easy for the Secretary of State to clone himself and to make 20 journeys to the Middle East and then also make 20 journeys to Northeast Asia. I have great empathy for my other former boss, but this situation is of such urgency that I'd like to see a much more serious effort by the administration to be creative and to think about what they can do. And I think Obama should have his ears open in both Tokyo and Seoul, where he may hear some ideas that he doesn't have to lead necessarily, but he needs to embrace if those initiatives are to have any prospect of success. So I would hope that he'd follow the advice of my old Senate colleague, Keith Luce, a Republican colleague from Senator Lugar's staff, with whom I traveled 3 times to North Korea. And Keith told me when I was joining Amnesty. He said, "Just remember, Frank, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Try to behave in those proportions." And maybe that's what Obama needs to do on this trip.
Please help me in thanking Frank Jannuzi. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for all your great work for Amnesty.
Thank you.
And we're very excited to have you as the new president of the Mansfield Foundation. The Korea Society is here and eager to work cooperatively with you on that. You have a very key role continuing to influence opinions in Washington and nationally on Asia. And it's really been an honor and a pleasure to have you at the Korea Society today.
Thanks so much,
thank you,
Stephen.
Frank
Thank you.
Jannuzi.
Thanks so much.
And thank you all.
Thank you.